Should be ready to go there. Okay. Let me make sure you don't. Are you ready? Go ahead.
Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to Pine Hill, June 27, 2021. And the topic of today's lesson is called An Amazing Feat. And we're going to be reading for our scriptures today, Matthew chapter 14. And we're going to concentrate on verses number 22 through 14, concentrating on verse number 22, as well as verse number 20 through verse number 33. The key verse for today's lesson is, immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of a little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Right here, we're dealing with Peter, and we're going to understand some of the teachers about faith today, how Jesus is going to teach us about having faith. And as we look at our Sunday school lesson and our Sunday school book, the lesson is broken down into different subtopics. And today, our first subtopic is going to be disaster comes. And we're going to concentrate on verses number 22 through 24, King James Version. And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had set the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain part to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. New International Version reads, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was great against it. If we're around in the church for a particular period of time, we've heard that Jesus walked on water and that Peter also wanted to walk on water with Jesus too as well. And when we look at this Sunday school lesson today, and we concentrate on verse number 22, and immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. We are here and we're dealing with Jesus, and Jesus here is ministering to the multitude of the people. But at the way on the boat, Lake Garcinet, if I'm speaking, and when they were out there on the boat, they're going to go through a horrific experience concerning dealing with the waves of the boat. But Jesus here is going to teach the disciples how to exercise their faith. So it says that, and when he dismissed the crowd, Jesus later on went to the mountainside beside himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. So we see here now that Jesus was ministering to a multitude of people. We see that Jesus had sent his disciples out on the lake ahead of him, that Jesus go to the mountainside by himself, that he might be able to pray. And it say later at night, Jesus was clearly there alone. And verse number 24, it reads, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because of the wind was against it. Again, Jesus sends the multitude to a different destination. He therefore went to a different destination up on the mountainside where he could be alone, and his disciples was out on a boat at sea. And what is taking place here, now Jesus can see that the disciples are out at sea and the boat is a considerably distance from land, and that the disciples is on the boat, but the disciples are going through some situations while out there on the boat. And the situation of disaster comes by terrible waves that is knocking against the boat. So we can see here how Jesus is setting us up to get us to prepared to how to exercise our faith. So when we look at the second subtopic, it's called Divinity Comes, and we're going to trade on verses number 25 through verse number 30, King James Version, and I'm going to read them out aloud, and you read along with me for you out there in virtual world that is tuned in with me. Starting at verse number 25, and in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me to come unto thee on the water. And he said, come. Peter was come down out of the ship. He walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried, saying, Lord, save me. New Version reads, shortly before the dawn, Jesus went out with them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It is a ghost, they said, and cried out of fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Lord, if it is you. Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came towards Jesus. When we look at verse number 25, and we're looking at from the New International Version, it said that currently Jesus had went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And it said later on that night, he was there alone. But when we look at verse number 25, so the disciples had to be out on the boat for the duration of the night. Because if we look at verse number 23, it tells us later in the night, Jesus was there alone. But when we look at verse number 25, it teaches us shortly before dawn. So if it was late in the night when Jesus was on the mountainside before himself, and shortly before dawn, that is the breaking of a new day, of a new morning. So Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Now we see that Jesus said earlier in verse number 24 that they were at a considerable distance from land, but he saw that the boat was buffeted by the waves because of the wind. So now what's happening is Jesus is saying that his disciples are in trouble, and Jesus is going to help the disciples. But the way Jesus come to the disciples is going to be mind-boggling and unbelievable, because they're out on a boat, and they're out on the boat and they're being troubled by the waves that is knocking outside of the boat. And Jesus is going to go out to the boat where the disciples are at to help the disciples. But when he go out on the boat, Jesus come out on the boat, go out to the boat on the water in a very mysterious way. In human nature, I know a lot of people are great swimmers and can swim very well, but I never seen a man have the ability to do what Jesus did. Jesus left the mountainside to go out to the lake, to the boat to help the disciples, but going out to the boat to help the disciples, Jesus' entrance was very grand. Jesus walked out to meet the disciples walking on water. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It is a ghost, they said, and cried out of fear. The disciples already in a compromising situation They were already perplexed mentally and emotionally based on by the storms and the winds that was bashing against the boat. Jesus was on the way to help them or rescue them, but they thought that it was a ghost, because clearly Jesus was walking on water, and they were completely terrified, and they cried out of fear. And you know, anything that takes us out of our comfort zone, our emotional man gets a little scared and afraid, and then our heart began to flutter, and then after our heart began to flutter, we start to mentally process the situation that we are in that is going to cause fear to set in. But here we see in verse number 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. I really, really, truly just love Jesus. How Jesus constantly tries to reassure us that everything is already going to be okay. Jesus showed up in a grand way by walking on water. Clearly, we see the disciples were afraid because they thought it was a ghost. But when Jesus was walking towards them, he told the disciples that take courage, be strong, gather yourself. It's okay. It is I. Don't be afraid. And here we go in verse number 20. Well, here's Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus. And Peter is saying that, and from their first imagination, with the man walking up, they thought that Jesus was a ghost. And then after Jesus declared that it was him and told them not be afraid, take courage. And then Peter also wanted to do what Jesus did. So Peter said that, Lord, if it be you, bid me to come out on the water. And we can see where your faith is really going to be put to test, and where your faith is going to be tried here, because Jesus is doing something that can't be done in the flesh. It's something that's done in the supernatural, walking out on water. But here Peter is wanting to be able to do the things that Jesus is doing only because of the power and the awesomeness of Jesus, that it is very mind-boggling that Jesus is walking on water. So if Jesus is walking on water, Peter is thinking, can he do the same thing too? But see, anything that we do, we should always ask in faith. So we see here before Peter decided to go out on the water and walk on his own accord, he asked God for permission, Jesus for permission. Allow me to come out and walk on the water with you. And when he asked Jesus for permission to come out to walk on the water with him, Jesus replied to him in verse number 29. He clearly told him, come, he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. So we have to look at what Peter is facing here. Earlier, we said that the disciple was on the boat and they were terrified and they were afraid. Then secondly, we see that Jesus is walking out to give the disciples a helping hand. But when he coming out, the disciple was already afraid because of the challenges that they were faced with by the waves and the wind that was hitting against the boat. And then Jesus had to calm them down and tell them to take courage, for it was him. And they realized that Peter realized that Jesus was who Jesus was, and that Jesus was walking on the water. And Peter wanted to walk out on the water with Jesus too. So Peter had faith in Jesus that he could walk on the water as well as Jesus, because Jesus gave him permission to do it. So Peter then came out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. Now you see what your faith gives you the ability to do, and you see what being obedient to the will of God can allow you to do. You can do some things that are impossible when you are walking in unity with God. So here we see that Peter did come out on the boat, and Peter began to walk toward Jesus, not on land, but on water. In verse number 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to say, cry out, Lord, save me. We see here clearly that God gave him the authority, that he could have the ability to walk on water because of his faith. And because of his faith, he had the ability to walk on water. But to be able to walk in the fullness that Jesus would have you to do with his power, you cannot become distracted by the things that are around you. Knowing Peter was already on a boat, that Peter had experienced fear because of the waves that was knocking against the boat. Peter had already experienced fear because when Jesus was walking, before he made himself known to the disciples that it was Jesus, in their finite mind, they automatically assumed that it was a ghost. So that is a second form of fear. And then to have the ability to walk on water because Jesus gave him the authority and okayed him that he could do it. And Peter walked on water. But again, Peter slipped because he lost his focus. Because again, he had experienced bad winds dealing with the waves of the boat. And again, when he saw the winds as he was walking on the water, he was afraid and he began to sink. What happened is here is that Peter took his eyes and his focus off of Jesus. And Peter began to concentrate more on the situation of the unfavorable circumstances by the wind that he was faced with. And at this particular time, he lost what God had given him, the ability to walk on water, because he gave at this particular time more credit to the unfavorable situation by the wind that what he saw and that he had experienced versus keeping his focus and his faith on the movement and the power of Jesus. So here we see in our third subtopic of our Sunday school lesson today, doubt comes. And this is what happened when we operate in our flesh, when we figure out the move and the movement and the will of God. God never told us to figure out how he was going to work out the unfavorable situations that we were dealing with and that we experienced while we on the journey called life. He told us just to trust him. Remember, our thoughts are not like God's thoughts. Our ways are not like God's ways. Our thoughts are just as off from God as heaven and the distance in between earth is. We cannot figure out how God is going to fix the problem. All we have to do is trust that he's going to work it out. So doubt comes because Peter again has taken his eyes off of the power of God, the power of Jesus, and the ability to walk on water because he had the authority to do it by Jesus. But here he is looking at all of the wind that is coming his direction. Verse number 31 through 33, King James Version read, and immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of a little faith, wherefore did thou doubt? And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased. Then they that were in the ship came and worshiped him, saying, of the truth, thou art the Son of God. New International Version reads, verse 31 through 33. It says, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of a little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, You are the Son of God. So if we go right back at verse number 30, and we will look at verse number 30 again. And Peter did walk on water because Jesus gave him the authority to do so. But unlike Jesus, Peter is like some of us. God can allow us to do some things, but the things they can allow us to do is mind-blowing, and we can't figure out how he is allowing us to do it. And then we come distracted by what is going on around us. So in verse number 30, again, Peter was distracted because it said clearly when he saw the wind, he was afraid. Began to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And see, one thing that I love about God, when you pray to God and you ask God to help you, and you ask God to help you wholeheartedly, we see here in verse number 31 that they were already in trouble. I mean, we see here in the lesson that they were already in trouble, and they were on the lake, and they were troubled by the winds and the waves of the boat. Jesus automatically was going to assist the disciples because the disciples was followers of his. And anything that Jesus loved, Jesus is going to take care of. So we see here in verse number 31, when Peter asked Jesus, cried out to ask Jesus to save me, it said in verse number 31, immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? See, the thing is, that's why we got to constantly ask God to help us, to help him, to keep us in the palm of his sweet holy hands. That we should have nothing in life to worry about. Because again, when Peter asked for help, the Bible telling us that Jesus didn't delay. It said that he stretched forth his hand and caught him. But when he caught him, there was something that Jesus wants us to learn from the experience that we're going through currently, is that you have a little faith. And he's telling you have a little faith because if I told you that it was okay to come out and walk on the water with me, that's the only thing that you should have focused on, is a walking on the water with me. Because if you were walking on the water with me, clearly you can see that that was something that was done in the supernatural, and that was done in that was not done within your will. That was something that was done in the will of Jesus to let him know that I got you. So here, why? Lost connection for a moment, but I did say this, looking at verse number 31, I prefer flesh, because again, you can do more things in the spirit than you can do in the flesh, because the flesh gets a little leery, and the flesh get a little weary, and the flesh get a little weak based off of the things that it experienced. So in verse number 32, it say, and when they come into the ship, the wind ceased. We got to see what we're learning from the lesson today. Now, it said earlier that Jesus on the mountainside late in the night, that he could pray and he was alone. It say before the break of dawn that Jesus walked out on the water to assist the disciples. Upon coming to the disciples' rescue, the disciples was already afraid. They automatically assumed that Jesus was a ghost. Jesus let them know exactly that it was him and told them to take courage, that they could calm down. Peter, again, asked Jesus, could he walk out on the water with him? And Jesus permitted him to do so. Peter lost his focus and paid attention to the winds and the surroundings, and the lake began. Computer. And okay, sorry again, we're having streaming issues, but to clear the Sunday school lesson up, go ahead and sum it up. Jesus revealed to the disciples just exactly who he is and exactly what he has going on and his power. You see here that the disciples had learned a lesson from being out at sea, and then they also learned the revelation of the power of Jesus Christ and who Jesus
Good
really.
morning, everyone.
Oh God. So here, Jesus taught us a lesson, and Jesus is telling us how to trust him and be faithful to him. And don't worry about the unfavorable circumstances that you're with. Keep your focus on him. And if you keep your focus on him, he's going to come to your rescue. We would like to thank you for tuning in to our virtual Sunday school at Pine Hill Missionary Baptist Church, June the 27th, 2021. I hope that this lesson can give you something to feed off of and something that you can digest, that one day you would need it and you'll know the reference back. Jesus is there with you in every crisis, but he is only as great as you will allow him to be in the midst of the crisis. Jesus will protect you. God bless you. Have a beautiful week, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah. Make sure